Thank you, Madam Speaker. It has been more than 13 years since the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. It's been 5 years this week since the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations attended the United Nations to announce that Canada is now a full supporter without qualification of the Declaration and affirmed Canada's commitment to adopt and implement this international human rights document in accordance with the Canadian Constitution. The introduction of C-15 last December fulfilled our government's commitment to introduce legislation by the end of 2020 to implement the declaration, establishing former private members bill C-262 as the floor rather than the ceiling. And I would like to take this opportunity to recognize the leadership of former Member of Parliament and my dear friend, Romeo Saganash. I want to take this opportunity to thank him for his work in Parliament and across the country with Indigenous peoples and communities to advance his private member's bill C-262 to implement the declaration right here in Canada. It was very disappointing that the bill 262 died on the order paper, unable to make it through the Senate process before the last federal election. I therefore urge all parliamentarians today to ensure that this does not happen again to bill C-15. The declaration is a result of decades of tireless efforts, negotiation, and sustained advocacy at the United Nations by inspiring Indigenous leaders from around the world, including many from Canada. From Dr. Willie Littlechild to former NDP MP Romeo Saganash to Sakej Henderson and so many others, Canadian Indigenous leaders played an instrumental role in the development of this historic international human rights document. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission stated that the declaration charts a path for reconciliation to flourish in 21st century Canada. And the TRC Call to Action 43 calls on all levels of government to fully adopt and implement this declaration. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls called on governments to immediately implement and fully comply with the declaration. The declaration is of critical importance to Indigenous peoples across Canada, and its implementation is essential to our shared journey toward reconciliation. It is long past time the Parliament of Canada passes legislation to implement the principles set out in the declaration. Once passed, Bill C-15 will affirm the declaration as a universal international human rights instrument with application in Canadian law and provide a framework for the Government of Canada's implementation of the declaration. This framework would establish new accountability for the Government of Canada to work with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples to find new ways to protect, promote, and uphold the human rights of Indigenous peoples across Canada. This legislative framework will further demonstrate Canada's continued commitment to uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples now and in the future. It will also bring further clarity to the path forward for Indigenous peoples, communities, industry, and all Canadians. Once passed by Parliament, the legislation will create new requirements for the Government of Canada to, in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, to take all necessary measures to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the Declaration and prepare and implement an action plan to achieve the objectives of the Declaration. Moving forward, the laws of Canada would be required to reflect the standards set out in the Declaration while also respecting Aboriginal and treaty rights recognized and affirmed in the Constitution. The legislation will require the Government of Canada to report annually to Parliament on progress made to align the laws of Canada with the Declaration and on the development and implementation of the action plan. This approach is consistent with the Declaration itself, which in Article 38 calls on states to collaborate with Indigenous peoples on appropriate measures, including legislative measures to achieve the goals set out in the Declaration. We acknowledge that some have expressed concern with the length and time for consultation on Bill C-15. It is important to recognize that PMB C-262, the foundation of this legislation, was also the subject of extensive parliamentary debate and study in the previous Parliament. Despite an accelerated engagement process for C-15, even during the pandemic, the bill's additions to the foundation of C-262 reflect the content requested by a wide cross-section of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis partners from coast to coast to coast. In total, over 70 virtual sessions took place, hearing the views of over 462 participants about potential enhancements to a consultation draft of legislative text based on former Private Members Bill C-262. Between June and November of 2020, the government held 33 bilateral sessions with the AFN, ITK, and MNC involving extensive technical discussions on the content of Bill C-15. Nitan Obad, the president of the Inuit Taprit Katanami, the National Indigenous Representative Organization for Inuit in Canada, told the Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples last Friday, and I quote, "We have worked positively and constructively with the federal government on the development of Bill C-15 within a relatively short time frame. I want to thank the Department of Justice and the Minister of Justice for ensuring the co-development happened within this particular piece of legislation, and also the government's willingness to be flexible and consider amendments throughout the process. Last fall, the government also undertook an extensive 6-week broader engagement with a wide cross-section of Indigenous partners on the development of the draft legislation through a series of virtual sessions. This engagement included modern treaty and self-governing First Nations, Inuit regions, other rights holders, national and regional women's organizations, youth, LGBTQ representatives, as well as some non-Indigenous stakeholders. More specifically, Madam Speaker, 28 engagement sessions were held with rights holders, modern treaty partners, other national, regional organizations, including women's organizations. 4 industry-specific roundtables were held with key sectors, minerals and metals, clean energy, forestry, and petroleum sectors, also including Indigenous participation. 5 sessions were held with provinces and territories, including 2 ministerial meetings. Some of these meetings also included Indigenous experts and leaders. There was also a roundtable with Indigenous youth from the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit Taprit Katanami and Métis National Council, Canadian Roots Exchange, and university law students. In addition, we received over 50 written submissions providing feedback and proposed text changes, including views and recommendations on the development of an action plan. An extensive, quote, "What We Learned" document is available on the Department of Justice website, which outlines the extensive feedback the government received throughout the engagement process. The extensive engagement with Indigenous partners and others led to key enhancements from former Private Members Bill C-262 to be included in Bill C-15. Bill C-15 has new language in the preamble, including highlight the positive contributions the declaration can make to reconciliation, healing, and peace, as well as harmonious and cooperative relations in Canada. It recognizes the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. It reflects the importance of respecting treaties and agreements, and it highlights the connection between the declaration and sustainable development. And finally, it emphasizes the need to take diversity of Indigenous peoples into account in implementing the legislation. A purpose clause has been included to address application of the declaration in Canadian law and to affirm the legislation as a framework for new federal implementation of the declaration. C-15 has clear and more robust provisions on the process of developing and tabling the action plan and annual reports. It has a provision to allow the Governor and Council to designate a minister to carry out elements of the Act. These changes and additions enhance and build upon the elements set out in Bill C-262. Madam Speaker, engagement also did not stop when the bill was introduced. Since the introduction of the bill in December, extensive meetings have been held with Indigenous partners and other stakeholders. These ongoing discussions, along with an extensive study at the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs, have informed a number of further amendments to C-15, which passed at the House Committee. And I want to take a moment to thank the members of the Standing Committee for their hard work and cooperation in getting this bill through. The amended bill now includes the specific rejection of the racist and colonial doctrines of discovery and terra nullius in the preamble. The preamble now also clarifies that Canadian courts have stated that Aboriginal and treaty rights recognized and affirmed in Section 35 of the Constitution Act are not frozen and capable of evolution and growth. Bill C-15 now expressly includes the term racism, in both the preamble and body of the legislation. Based on consensus advice from Indigenous partners, the government also agreed to amend the timeline to co-develop the action plan from 3 years to 2, a timeline we're confident is sufficient for a meaningful process and a co-development of an effective action plan. Our government is committed to meaningful co-development of Bill C-15's action plan with Indigenous partners and experts to ensure that the implementation of the legislation is effective and accountable. The bill itself sets out that the action plan must include measures to address injustices, combat prejudice, and eliminate all forms of violence, racism, and discrimination, including systemic racism and discrimination against Indigenous peoples and Indigenous elders, youth, children, women, men, persons with disabilities, and gender diverse and two-spirit persons. It must promote mutual respect and understanding as well as good relations, including through human rights education. The action plan must also include measures related to monitoring, oversight, recourse or remedy, or other accountability measures with respect to the implementation of the declaration. We've already begun preliminary discussions with Indigenous partners on the design of the future process, and Budget 2021 provides $31.5 million over 2 years to support the action plan's co-development. Some of my conservative colleagues have framed the concept of the free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, as an undefined statement, and have suggested that it could be interpreted as a de facto veto for individual Indigenous communities or groups over resource development. And I note that the term veto is nowhere to be found in the draft of the text. They have tried to raise concerns that this would jeopardize the economy and bring uncertainty to the resource sector. In fact, Madam Speaker, FPIC focuses on the inclusion of voices, concerns, and opinions of all Indigenous peoples that would be affected by a proposed activity or project, and then ensuring that these concerns are addressed and that there are mitigation plans in place. I think Dr. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond addressed this best when she spoke to the House Committee on behalf of the Assembly of First Nations on April 13th, where she said, and I quote, "There's an element of what I would call fear-mongering about the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, that somehow that will cause economic damage and so forth. In fact, free, prior, and informed consent and operationalizing that by having industry, government, and First Nations work within appropriately early in the context of recognizing the rights provides more economic stability, certainty, and security." In conclusion, Madam Speaker, just last week, National Chief Perry Bellegarde, representing the Assembly of First Nations, spoke in favor of passing Bill C-15 at the Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples. And he stated, and I quote, "I urge you all to seize this historic opportunity and to play a key role in upholding and advancing the human rights of Indigenous peoples." At the same Senate committee meeting, Netan Obed, the president of ITK, said, "We will see this piece of federal legislation as a positive contribution to the approach of human rights being applied equally to all Canadian citizens." David Chartrand, speaking for the Métis National Council, told the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs on April 15th, and I quote, "We believe that passing of this bill into law is critical to a future that respects our rights as a nation. We urge members to expedite the process of ensuring that Bill C-15 is passed in this session of Parliament. While no piece of legislation will get unanimous support from all Indigenous peoples in Canada, Bill C-15 has broad support from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis from coast to coast to coast. C-15 is about shredding our colonial past and writing the next chapter together as partners with Indigenous peoples. I therefore urge all members of the House to support this fundamental piece of legislation and to support Bill C-15. Thank you, Miigwech, and I look forward to questions from my colleagues.